Hello, it's Peter Downs here and welcome to part 1 on adaptation theory to practice. Now, one of the things we really like to take a crack at here at the Inclusion Club is translating theory into practice. Now, generally speaking, you can separate research-based theory and practice into two camps. There is research and there is practice. Unfortunately, it's often the case that the two things are quite different and separate from each other. They are isolated, which is not the way it should be really. Research and theory should inform practice. So we like to try and bridge the gap between theory and practice here at the Inclusion Club. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to introduce you today, a great pleasure to introduce you to the work of a man who really does understand this, and most importantly connects research and practice in a very positive way. He studies adaptation theory and puts it into practice. His name is Shaker Hutzler from the Zinman College of Physical Education and Sports Sciences at the Wingate Institute in Israel. I've known Shaker for a number of years here. Now we're going to take a look at what Shaker calls a systematic ecological model for adapting physical activities, or SEMA for short. Now don't be afraid, you'll remember that we have previously considered a few practical models for adapting activities, such as tree and step. Well, Shaker's work provides a really good theoretical foundation for these models too, as they are closely related. What we'll try to do here is to summarize in a practical way the basis for Shaker's ecological model and explain its application to everyday settings. At the bottom of this episode you can download a paper that explains the ecological model in much greater depth. So, what's the theory? So what's the theory behind Shaker's model? We'll refer to it as SEMA. We are going to look at three. All three are based on the understanding that the success or otherwise of activities is a determinant of the individual, their environment, and the task to be performed. You must consider all three to determine a best fit in any given situation. The first theory is called action systems theory. Think of it this way. Here you have Joe, little naked white guy again. Joe is 1.7 meters tall, weighs 81 kilograms, is quick, not very well coordinated, but quite strong. These are his personal and unique resources, unique to Joe. Now, how well Joe performs in certain tasks is dependent to a degree on these resources and how well Joe applies them. But it's also determined by the environment at any given moment. How well Joe is able to swim may depend on the temperature of the water. How well he is able to catch a moving object may depend on the wind or the surface Joe has to move on. Joe has to adapt to this too. So there is an interaction here that is critical to the performance of the task. In addition, Joe's performance is governed by the requirements of the task, how complex or easy it is. Throwing a dart requires fine motor skills, good balance and accuracy. This would be different from bowling a 10-pin, which requires more strength and more gross body movement. So how well Joe is able to do in these tasks is a result of the interaction between Joe and his personal resources, what he can and can't do, the environment and the requirements of the task. This is the basis of action systems theory. Now, it'd be really good to be able to measure this, wouldn't it? If we can measure them, then we can understand the influence one or more of the parameters have on the performance of the task and adapt and modify accordingly. Remember the model. It's about the individual and their personal resources, the environment and its influences, and the actual requirements of the task. It would be great if we could be able to measure those. Now it's worth considering for a moment, before we move on, the World Health Organization and their adoption of the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health. It was adopted in 2001. The ICF has provided policymakers across the world with a more contemporary view on disability. For the first time, there is a consideration of the environment in how we define disability. Hooray for that! The ICF also gives us more detail on our three parameters. It identifies barriers and facilitators. Basically, the things that restrict participation across the three parameters and those that promote and support participation across the three parameters. It looks at things like impairment of the body in the individual, what they cannot do, and the functions of the body, what they can do. In terms of the environment, it looks at the physical environment, accessibility issues, for example. It looks at the social environment too, which is the attitudes of others towards participation of someone with a disability. And it also looks at the tasks at hand, the actual complexity and the requirements of the task, and also the objectives of the task. Are the objectives performance, high performance, or participation? Now, do you see the connection here to models such as tree and step? These models help us identify what needs to change across these functions that impact on the person, their environment, and the task at hand. Now, the good news is we can measure these parameters and use something called ecological task analysis, or ETA. Now, ETA attempts to do this. Essentially, it applies an structural and assessment system to action systems theory. Basically allows us to be able to measure it. Importantly, it also allows for experimentation and choice in decision making. So it takes a broader view. Exploration and experimentation is important, as there is no instant formula here. It's at the core of models such as tree and step. What's also very interesting here, as Shaikey points out, is that there are a set of principles for understanding the relationships between environmental conditions and the resources of the individual. Without going into too much detail here, I would say this is all about understanding how people can adapt to situations as the parameters of the task change. Think of it this way. If we throw a ball at Joe, he'll find a way to catch it. How he adapts to catching it will depend very much, to a large extent, on how big the ball is, its weight, its texture, and maybe even its colour in contrast to its surroundings. We know that Joe is not very well coordinated, but let's say he can successfully catch a volleyball quite easily with two hands and sometimes with one hand. So how successful Joe is depends on the interaction between Joe and his resources and the ball. But what if we change the type of ball? Poor old Joe is going to have problems here. This changes the interaction a lot. This simple thing can facilitate or be a barrier to participation. This is why individualized learning programs beats the pants off predetermined programs, and that is why it's so important to incorporate experimentation and choice into activity situations. Moving on then to adaptation theory. Now this is very similar to action systems theory, but goes a step further. Claudine Sherrill, who you see on the screen here, in 1995 wrote one of the seminal papers on adaptation theory. She wrote, "Now we realize that it is unjust to assess only the individual with a disability. We must assess his or her environment or ecosystem and identify the attitudinal, aspirational and architectural barriers and affordances that interact to impact the learning and practice of physical activity." And like I say, that was Claudine Sherrill in 1995. Now Shaikey has encapsulated this in a nice model, which I'm going to sketch out for you here in my own way. You can see a better example in the paper that you can download in this episode. But let's remember, we have the task at hand, we have the person, the individual, and their individual resources, and we have the environmental impact as well. And you have the interaction between all of these things. In the task you have things like the complexity of the task. The objectives, is the objective purely participation, interaction with peers, or is it performance, trying to achieve a particular goal? The equipment will have an impact on the task, the physical requirements of the task as well, just to name a few. Similar with the person. There are body functions of the person, there are communication functions of the person, there are neurological functions of the person, spatial awareness that the person has, their current level of skills, their motivation, things that are particular to the individual. And finally, the environment, which would include things like accessibility, attitudes and support of peers, of teachers, of parents, of professionals in that field, community resources that are available, family resources that are available, including finances, transport, and professional support that's available. How well trained are the people who are there? Are they professional coaches? Are they volunteers? Okay, Shaker's model. Shaker's been experimenting with the ecological task analysis for many years at his centre in Israel. Now this is really a cool application of theory into practice. Now the SEMA model is a result of this experimentation and learning over time. It differs from the original ETA model in 5 ways which are worth considering here before we look at a practical example. First, it links to the terminology of the International Classification of Functioning that we looked at from the World Health Organization. Second, it includes criteria that can be used to assess task accomplishment. So there are actual criteria in the SEMA model that we can use to measure the 3 parameters that we've looked at. It recognizes factors that limit or facilitate task accomplishment, so it has an ability to recognize the barriers and facilitators. It includes a systematic adaptation of parameters rather than only relying on experimentation. Experimentation and choice are important, but what the SEMA does is allow for a systematic adaptation of those parameters based on the measurement and the understanding of limiters and facilitators. And finally, it encourages but does not require choices for selecting types of movement. As I just mentioned, as I just talked about, choice and experimentation are important, but doesn't require that for selecting the types of movement here. Okay, we're going to end part 1 there. Now we'll give you a summary of an example of how this is applied in practice, but not until the next episode here. What I want to do is to establish some of the theory and research. You can download Shaker's paper from this episode as well, and also look at the infographic that we've provided that should give a short summary and a quick look at the theoretical component, the theory and research behind the SEMA model. In the next episode, part 2, we're going to look at a practical example of what this means in reality and link theory and practice. So I look forward to talking with you then. Thank you.